Hi, and welcome to another narration presented by yours truly, Cryptids Roost. Let's just take a moment's silence for all the haters. That's enough. Be sure to check out the blooper reel at the end of the video, which is then followed by the end screen where you will find more videos listed. So grab your coffee, sit back and enjoy the show. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is not. I followed the GPS on my stolen motorcycle, parts 1 to 3, the full series. This awesome series is written by the Reddit author, Moto-XL. Moto-XL also has their very own YouTube channel where they also narrate creepypasta stories. You'll find them listed under the channel name of Moto Camping Stories. That link will also be listed below, so be sure to check them out. Part 1. Molly. The GPS tracker brought me to the edge of a forest off Route 65. Only idiots steal bikes, so I had expected the thief that had stolen mine to be some inbred redneck in a trailer park. I figured that could still have been the case, but maybe the guy had ditched the bike when he had saw it had a GPS locator. Blaring his horn a few times as a goodbye, the trucker that had dropped me off pulled back onto the highway and was gone. The GPS screen I held said my bike was a few hundred feet into the forest, but as I stared at the oak and elm trees in front of me, I started regretting coming alone. I should have called a few of the citizens from my club to tag along, but it was too late for that now, so I hopped the guardrail and entered the forest. Despite the fact I was wearing my jacket and it was the middle of spring, it felt cold. The crescent moon barely provided any light. I pulled out my cell phone and used the flashlight to see, but I still stumbled over branches and roots every once in a while. When less than 100 feet was between me and my bike, the air grew humid and started to fester with the smell of rotting fish. There was no breeze, but the tree branches creaked every few seconds. It was as if all the trees were alive, and they were breathing their stinking breath in my face. As I continued on, my heart started to beat a lot faster, and I saw something that almost made me turn back. Strung up by their own intestines were dozens of dead animals, for who or what had strung them up hadn't just cut out the intestines and tied them round the animals' necks. Instead, the entire animals had been flipped inside out. Apparently, their whole bodies had been pushed up through their mouths, and then the intestines were tied around the trees. Some of the hunks of flesh were the size of dogs, others the size of opossums, but it was hard to testify what one of the creatures actually were. Some of them were fresh, still dripping red blood and brown bile. Others were old, and any liquid that had stayed on the flesh was now black and dry. As I discovered the hanging animals, the humidity got thicker, and the sound of the creaking tree branches sped up a little, as if the trees were excited I had discovered their secret. I almost turned back at the sight of that malevolent menagerie, and the only thing that stopped me was the distant rev of my bike's engine. It lasted for about 5 seconds before stopping. A few seconds later, it sounded off again, and again lasted for about 5 seconds. The GPS tracker indicated the bike was stationary. I wanted to call the cops, but when I looked at my phone, it said I had no bars. I picked up a baseball bat-sized stick, positioned it so that I could hold it and my phone. I swallowed hard and pushed deeper, avoided the tangling, dripping bodies as I went. I noticed there weren't many flies. I wondered if even they were too afraid to come to this place. The closer I got to my bike, the less I needed the GPS, so I put it in my jacket pocket. When I was less than 30 feet away, I could almost hear a squishing sound accompanying the revving engine. I slowed my steps to try and be as quiet as I could, but my mind raced with what I would do when I confronted the thief. If they were crazy enough to string up dozens of animals by their guts, they were absolutely crazy enough to kill me. My only option was to take them by surprise with a hard blow to the back of the head. I made it to the clearing where my bike was laying on the ground and froze. But I didn't freeze because I was caught. I froze because the thief wasn't what I had expected. The thief was facing me, but it didn't seem to care I was there. The thief was almost human, but nothing was quite right. It had arms and legs, but they were too thin, and the knees and elbows were too circular. Its fingers were long and slender as well. Its head had relatively normal features, but its mouth had no lips, just 2 rows of blunt teeth dappled with brown and black dots. Its bulging eyes were focused on a squirming cat that it was holding down with one hand next to my bike's rear wheel. The creature's other hand was on the throttle. I closed my eyes to look around, and my body remained petrified. The trees around the clearing were all splattered with blood. The remnants of other dead animals lay on the ground around the trees. It was as if the creature was painting. The roar of the engine echoed through the trees, and the cat was ground to mush. Its blood splattered on me, and I jumped, shivering and whimpering, but still otherwise unable to move. While keeping the rest of its body still, the creature's eyes jerked to me. It was then that I realised the rhythmic creaking sounding of the branches was in sync with the creature's breathing. Slowly rising to its full height, the creature never stopped staring at me. It dropped the remaining bits of the cat and the throttle, and it looped its long fingers around my waist. It felt like tree branches were being wrapped around me. It opened its mouth wide as if it meant to swallow my head, so I held up my arms and hands to protect myself. The flashlight blinded the creature and it dropped me. I landed on my butt, but was on my feet in an instant. I ran as fast as I could back in the direction I had come, eventually breaking through the line of trees and stumbling back onto the highway. I tried to catch my breath and quiet my racing heart as I scanned the trees for any sign of movement. I saw nothing, but continued to hear the rhythmic creak of the tree branches, and it sent icy fingers down my spine. Unsure of what else to do, I started walking down the highway in the direction I hoped would take me home. After a few minutes of walking, a pair of headlights appeared down the highway, and I sprinted towards them, waving my hands above my head to flag down the old Chevy. It screeched to a stop when it spotted me. I opened the passenger door and hopped in, buckling my seatbelt.
Gee, mister, you've got blood all over you. Everything okay?
The driver said in a slow, unsettling tone.
I'm fine,
but there's some sort of monster in the forest. Take me to a police station, I replied, taking a breath every few seconds. The driver chuckled and continued driving. We sped past where I had been and took the next exit. Taking a right turn, the driver headed down the road. We passed a sign for the sheriff's office, but the driver kept going. You sure you know where you're going? I said, wondering if there was more than one station.
Oh, sure, but I don't think you should go to the police station. They'll just think you're crazy,
the driver said, still talking in a slow, unsettling way.
You see, it sounds like you've gone and had an encounter with Molly.
My heart started pounding.
Now, I wouldn't say Molly's my friend, but me and her got somewhat of a mutual understanding. I understand she doesn't like it when people run from her. On the other hand, when Molly lets you go, You aren't scared a bit. I can testify to that. She opens your eyes to things you've never seen before. But when you run from Molly, you get scared. And you, sir, you're scared. I cocked back a fist, but before I could drive it forward, I felt a sharp and consistent pain. I looked down and saw the stun gun for a second before slipping out of consciousness.
Part 2. The Ritual. Something cold and wet, dripping against my face, pulled me into consciousness. I blinked a few times, and for a split second I thought everything I had just experienced was a nightmare. But as the blur from my eyes cleared, I saw that it had all been real. The guy that had tased me in his Chevy was dragging me by the ankle through the dangling animals that had been flipped inside out and strung up by their intestines. It was hard to see with the only light from the moon, but I could tell blood from some of the fresh ones had been what was dripping on my face. Chevy was also wearing a backpack. I groaned and tried to pull against his grip, but my entire body felt like it had been pounded with a meat mallet. A weak struggle caused my captor to glance back at me. He smirked before turning back to watch where he was going. The further we went, the darker it seemed to get. The eerie creaking branch sound was steady and rhythmic, and my mouth went dry as I thought about being around Molly again. When Chevy stopped dragging me, it was too dark to see anything further than a few inches from my face. He grunted as he propped me against a tree. My strength started to return, and as if he could sense it happening, he tied my hands together. Then he tied my feet. I heard the sound of rustling paper and then a popping sound. Then I heard something that resembled the sound of striking a match a few times before the hiss and bright red light of a road flare registered. The area was illuminated and I jumped. Molly was right in front of me, her bulging eyes tinted red from the flare, her long and slender arms dangling down to just above the ground. The light stretched ghastly shadows back from her figure that twitched from the light. Molly's eyes were focused on the ground at my feet. Chevy situated the flare on the ground before pulling out a second flare and lighting it as well. Molly continued to stare at the ground, unmoving. He put the second flare a little further away, and I confirmed that we were in the same clearing I had been in before. My bike was in the same spot. Walking around Molly and standing in front of me, Chevy pulled out a knife. Instead of stabbing me with it, he pricked his thumb. Then he switched hands and pricked his other thumb. He then put the knife away and knelt in front of me, smirking as he placed his thumbs together at the centre of my forehead. He smeared a line of blood out to my hairline and I grimaced. Molly's bulging eyes snapped to me, but nothing else on her moved. Pulling the knife back out, the guy cut my ankles free and forced me to my feet. When I was standing, Molly's body quivered and sounded like cracking twigs. I swallowed hard as she took a stiff step towards me. She reached out her slender fingers and wrapped her hand around the back of my head, easing it towards her. Her bulging eyes stared into mine. She bent over and without breaking her stare, slowly opened her mouth, wider than any jaws should go. Her missing lips and cheeks made the ordeal more terrifying, so I shut my eyes. I'd always thought getting decapitated would be a terrible way to die, but having my head chewed off seemed worse. I felt the wind from Molly's jaw closing and heard the sound of her teeth clank together, and for a split second I was confused as to how I hadn't felt them. But then a searing pain on the side of my head told me she had bit through my ear instead of my head.
I screamed and struggled against my restraints, but Chevy held me firm by the shoulders. With the chunk of my ear still clenched between her teeth, Molly stood in front of me for a few seconds, still staring. She eased her free hand up from her side and used 2 fingers to pull out my ear. She let my head go and took a few stiff, twitchy steps towards the closest tree. Using a sharpened fingernail on her free hand, she carved a symbol I didn't recognise into the blood-splattered bark. Then she tore my ear into strips and put the pieces inside the symbol. Seeing it made me quiver. Molly carved symbols in every tree in the clearing before coming back to me. Chevy pulled a long rope out from his bag. He looped it around my hand restraints before tossing one end over a low branch. Molly gripped my shoulders and lifted me up, and Chevy assisted until I was dangling from the branch. I instantly thought of the flipped inside-out animals and knew that I was next. Chanting in some language I didn't understand, Chevy pulled out a 3rd road flare and ignited it. He walked a steady pace in a circle around the clearing, chanting louder as he went and pointing the flare at the blood-splattered trees for a few seconds at a time. Then Molly put the palm of one hand against my bottom, and she wrapped her other hand around the base of my neck so that she could push against my collarbone. Lifting me up a little and slackening the rope, she started to squeeze her arms together. I felt my spine compress. I panicked as I thought of being flipped inside out, jerking as much as I could to cause her to lose her grip. I succeeded and she lost the grip on my bottom, removing the hand around my neck to try and steady me. When she let go of my neck, all of my weight was transferred back to the tree branch and it snapped. I hit the ground with my hands still tied, struggling to get back on my feet. I was successful and Chevy stopped chanting, charging towards me with the flare. With no other options, I jumped and drop kicked him in the face. He slumped forward and I hit the ground again, but rolled over and made it back to my feet. I ran towards the edge of the clearing, stooping down to grab a flare before continuing. I glanced back just as I passed the edge of the clearing, and my heart dropped when I realised Molly was pursuing. Her run was as stiff as her walk, but her arms dangled at her side. Each move forward seemed jerkier than the last, but her stare was as unflinching as ever. At first, when we left the clearing, Molly vanished in the darkness since only I was carrying the flare. But as she gained on me, I could barely see her in the low red light. I thought if I could just make it to the road, I would be safe. Perhaps the forest was her prison and only I could exit. So I ran and ran and ran as fast as my legs would go. I hopped over downed trees and exposed roots. I dodged between trees, weaving around vines, but every time I looked back, Molly was there, closing the gap with her jerky gait and unflinching gaze. As Molly ran, I noticed the sounds of creaking branches transmogrified into the sound of dry leaves rustling in the wind. The more she closed the gap, the louder the sound became. It scratched against my ears and made my skin crawl. When it was loud enough to make me want to cover my ears, it suddenly stopped. I glanced over my shoulder and Molly was gone. I turned back around and saw the exit, but as I neared, the sound of rustling leaves returned, this time growing louder the closer I went to my salvation. I slowed my stride to a jog, knitting my brows together. A few feet from the tree line, I stopped. The sound of a car rolling down the road reached me, but I still couldn't move. In the red light of the flare, I saw Molly's slender figure uncurl from a branch on the tree directly ahead of me. Apparently she had balled up against the branch and then, holding on with one arm, slowly rolled down until her feet touched the ground. She stood in front of me no more than 6 feet away. Behind her was freedom. I took a deep breath and hurled the flare at her as hard as I could before running forward. I hoped the distraction would buy me enough time to make it past her. I was wrong. The flare bounced off her head, but she never stopped staring at me. I barely saw her arm as it swung forward and hit me in the nose. The world spun for a few seconds before the darkness enveloped me. Part 3. The finale. Molly's house. Nothing in particular roused me awake, but I came to and blinked a few times. My head felt like a cherry bomb had gone off inside it, and I groaned. Looking around, I saw there was one window on the right wall of the room. Bare wooden planks comprised the floor, and an open door was behind me. The walls were also made of wood, but the boards used were uneven and bumpy, as if various pieces of trees had been chopped up and plastered together, without any attempt to sand or smooth them. Dappled across the uneven wall were hundreds of symbols that had to have been carved with one of Molly's claws. Thinking of her, I started to panic. I assumed I would have been tied up in preparation of some new and horrific ritual, but I was free. Nothing bound me to the wooden chair I was in, so I stood and checked the window. It was barred and without glass, but I could see that the sun was starting to rise, staining the bellies of the clouds in the sky, pink and purple and navy. I exited the room with caution, wondering if I had been left alone because either Chevy or Molly were nearby. Outside the first room was a larger room that made up the bulk of the bottom floor. There was a kitchen in the far corner, but it was pulled out from the wall and didn't appear to be hooked up to anything. There was no furniture, and the walls were covered in similar symbols to the room I had woken up in. There were also a few empty shelves and windows scattered throughout. Light from the rising sun cast long silhouettes off the windows onto the floor and reminded me of cages. There was another small room opposite the kitchen, but I couldn't see inside of it. In between the room and the kitchen was a staircase. The front door was to my left, and I ran up to it. My heart sank a little as I realised it had been padlocked shut. The body of the lock was as big as my fist, and the shackle was as thick as my finger. It was fastened to a latch as long as my arm that was bolted to the wall and half the door. There was no way I was going to break it down. I needed the key. Walking as carefully as I could and wincing at every squeak of the floorboards, I made my way to the other room. It was essentially empty, but the floor was covered in puddles of blood, and all of the symbols had what I assumed to be strips of flesh jammed into them. Turning my attention to the kitchen, I checked behind the stove, but found nothing. I checked inside the stove, and the door screeched a little when I opened it. Inside, crumpled into a ball, was a human body, and seeing it made me jump. I looked around and strained my ears to see if I could detect any sounds or signs of movement in the house. Nothing registered, so I made my way to the steps and tiptoed up them. Broken up by a small landing, the steps doubled back about halfway up. In front of the top of the steps was another small landing that was in front of a large room. The room had no door, and as I walked inside, my heart turned into a galloping horse within my chest. Molly was sitting in a wooden chair with her back to the doorway, her arms hanging at her side with the backs of her wrists on the wooden floor. A single shelf ran along the perimeter of the room, and there was a window at the centre of 3 of the walls. If the key wasn't inside this room, I didn't know what I would do to escape. I had to force myself to take each step, and I grew increasingly shaky as I made my way around the room, searching for the key. I kept glancing at Molly as I went, anticipating her gaze to lock onto me at any second. As I went further around the room, I realised that Molly was staring at something. Displayed at her feet was a withered flower. The stem faced her, but below the flower petals was a creature that resembled Molly in every way, except that it was a quarter of her size. It was curled in the fetal position. I was unable to tell if it was alive or dead. Molly's bulging eyes were fixed on the bodies before her as if contemplating something. Beads of sweat turned to streams as I saw my worst fears are realised. The key that had to be to the front door was sitting on Molly's lap. I reached out a shaky hand, and it took everything inside of me to keep from turning into a sobbing mess. As I neared the key, Molly's eyes snapped up towards me, and every hair on my body stood on end. My skin crawled and my heart pounded harder and faster until I could feel my pulse in my ears. Aside from the eye movement, nothing else changed. All was quiet except the distant sound of creaking branches. Whimpering, I pushed my hand forward and grabbed the key. Molly never broke her gaze with me, and I retracted with wide eyes, wondering how I was still alive. I started to make my way back towards the door, and Molly's eyes started jerking back and forth between me and the bodies on the floor. I stopped the first time she did it, questioning if I could make it to the door before she could swing one of her arms around to hit me. When she didn't move any other parts of her body, I again eased towards the door. Then Molly stood up. The sound of the creaking branches grew a little louder, and I ran. I hit the steps and tripped, tumbling down and hitting the wall on the landing before the stairs doubled back. It hurt, but I pushed up from the landing and essentially hopped down the remaining steps to the floor. I sprinted to the front door and fumbled with the lock, trying to quiet my heart so I could hear if Molly was pursuing me. The creak of the floorboards told me she was. After what felt like hours, I finally got the key in and turned. I wrenched off the padlock and flew open the latch, yanking the door open and jumping outside. A small dirt road snaked out away from the cabin. The grass around the cabin was fairly long, and I expected to hear crickets or locusts or anything, but all was silent save for the constant sound of creaking branches. Looking to my left, I saw Chevy. He had a rag in his hand and was standing beside my motorcycle. He saw me and lowered his head, smirking for a moment before charging towards me. The sound of dry leaves rustling in the wind reached me, and my heart continued to race inside my chest. The last time I heard the sound of rustling leaves, Molly was running towards me, and I assumed the same was happening at that moment. Chevy pulled out his knife when he neared me and thrust it forward. I sidestepped, and he lost his balance when he tried to compensate, falling on his stomach with a thud. I figured he would have the key to my bike, and my bike would be the only way I could escape. So I flipped him over and cocked back a fist ready to punch his nose into the back of his head. But when I flipped him over, I saw that he had fallen on the knife. It appeared to have punctured his lung. I took it out and plunged it into where I thought his heart was. He exhaled one last time. The rustling sound of dry leaves grew louder as I checked his pockets. I found the key and sprinted to my bike. When the engine turned over, my whole body sighed in relief, and I hit the throttle just as Molly burst through the front door. I headed for the dirt road and was grateful to see her get smaller and smaller. When I reached the highway, I gunned it until I hit 100. I started crying at the taste of freedom and the feeling of the wind whooshing around my face. The skin around where my ear had been started to sting, and I remembered the ear had been bitten off earlier, but I was happy to be alive. To feel the wind on my face and hear the sound of it washing over me was a relief. But something was wrong. The sound grew louder and louder, and as I continued, I found it was difficult to differentiate the sound of the wind from the sound of rustling dry leaves. I hope you all enjoy the following blooper reel.
If you would like to support the channel and buy me a very much loved coffee, you can send your donations, big or small, to paypal.me/cryptidsroost. I figured that could still have been the case, but I should have called a few of the citizens from my club to tag along. I wanted to call the cops, but when I looked at my phone, it said I had no bars. After a few minutes of walking, a pair of headlights appeared down the highway, and I sprinted towards them, waving my hands above my head to flag down. After a few minutes of walking, a pair of headlights appeared down the highway, and I sprinted towards them, waving my hands above my head to flag down the old Chevy.
You see, it sounds like you've gone and had an encounter. An encounter with Molly.
The guy that had tased me in his Chevy was dragging me by the ankle through the dangling animals that had been flipped inside out and strung up by their intestines. My weak struggle caused my captor to glance back at me. She reached out her slender fingers and wrapped her hand around the back of my head. He looped it around my hand restraints before tossing one end over a low branch. I instantly thought of the flipped inside out animals and knew that I was next. Chanting in some language I didn't understand, Chevy pulled out a third row flare and ignited it. When she let go of my neck, all of my weight was transferred back to the tree branch and it snapped. I hopped over down trees and exposed roots. But as I neared, the sound of rustling leaves returned. Dappled across the uneven wall were hundreds of symbols that had to have been carved with one of Molly's claws. And all of the symbols had what I assumed to be strips of flesh jammed into them. Inside, crumpled into a ball, was a human body, and seeing it made me jump. I kept glancing at Molly as I went, anticipating her gaze to lock onto me at any second. Aside from the eye movement, nothing else changed. I hit the steps and tripped, tumbling down and hitting the wall on the... fuck's sake. I hit the steps and tripped, tumbling down and hitting the wall on the landing before the stairs doubled back. A small dirt road snaked out away from the cabin. Chevy pulled out his knife when he neared me and thrust it forward. It appeared to have punctured his lung. The skin around where my ear had started to sting. And I remembered the ear had been bitten off earlier. Hey family, please be so kind as to punch the like button and smack the arse of the subscription button as well. And remember to chokehold that notification bell and then select all. That way you'll receive all notifications each time I upload a new video. And by subscribing, you'll be the first to see all of our new spooky creepypasta stories. A very big thank you to Moto-XL for allowing me to narrate this awesome series. Make sure to check out Moto-XL's Reddit for more brilliant stories. Also be sure to check out the Moto-XL playlist here for more of their stories that I have already narrated. I would just like to say a very big thank you to all of the authors that I have worked with and all the ones that I will work with in the future. So thank you all, my brothers and sisters. And why not hashtag cryptidsroost in your comments. If you would like to support the channel, I have an account at buymeacoffee.com. You can send your coffee donations, big or small, to that site, link is below, or via paypal.me/cryptidsroost. And don't forget to check out the end screen, see above, that will also list some more videos in my back catalogue. Take care everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful and peaceful night. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is not.